The entire tasting panel burst into laughter the moment Leonard Hoyt carried his cake through the door. Not polite laughter, not the kind people hide behind their hands at fancy industry events. This was open, unguarded, the kind that echoes off marble floors and expensive lighting fixtures. 3 James Beard nominees sat at that long table, and every single one of them was laughing at a man in a flour-dusted apron who had driven 4 hours from rural Tennessee with a cake box held together by painter's tape. The head judge, a woman whose name appeared on the covers of culinary magazines Leonard had studied for years, leaned toward her colleague and said something quietly. Then she looked at Leonard and delivered the verdict with the flat courtesy of someone who had done this many times before. "This isn't what we're looking for. The presentation alone disqualifies it." Leonard nodded once. He picked up the cake box without a word, and from somewhere near the back of the prep kitchen, a dishwasher who had been quietly watching the whole thing set down a stack of sheet pans and said, almost to himself, "I'd eat that." Nobody in that room understood yet that the humiliation they were witnessing was only the beginning of something none of them would forget. If the stories of people who refuse to stay down still matter to you, and they should, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe to Kindness Tales for more. Leonard Hoyt spent most of his adult life doing 2 things, baking and raising his daughter alone. He was 43 years old, wide-shouldered in the way of men who have done physical work their whole lives, with hands that were simultaneously gentle enough to fold meringue and strong enough to split firewood without much effort. He ran a small custom cake shop out of the converted garage behind his house in Millbrook, Tennessee, a town of about 4,000 people where the nearest competitor was a grocery store bakery 12 miles down the highway. The shop had no sign. Customers found it through word of mouth, which in Millbrook moved faster than any algorithm. Brides came to him 6 months in advance. Mothers called him for birthday cakes and cried on the phone describing their kids. A retired schoolteacher once drove 90 minutes to order a cake shaped exactly like the first classroom she ever taught in, down to the cracks in the chalkboard she still remembered. Leonard had a gift. Everyone in Millbrook knew it. But Millbrook was Millbrook, and the world beyond its county lines had never heard of him. That might have stayed true forever if his wife hadn't died. Marguerite Hoyt passed away from an aggressive cancer 3 weeks after their daughter Iris turned 7. The illness moved faster than the doctors predicted, which Leonard later said was somehow both the worst part and the only mercy. There wasn't enough time to watch her suffer as long as they feared. What there was enough time for was financial ruin. Medical bills accumulated with the quiet cruelty of compound interest. The small savings they had built disappeared. Leonard's plan to expand the shop, to maybe open something real with a proper storefront and a commercial kitchen, evaporated completely. He adjusted. That was the word people in Millbrook used when they talked about Leonard in those years. He adjusted. He took on more orders. He woke at 4 in the morning to start prep work so he could get Iris to school by 8. He baked through evenings, while she did homework at the kitchen island, narrating her day in the detailed and slightly chaotic way of elementary schoolers, bouncing between stories about tacit recess politics, and asking Leonard why fondant smelled the way it did, and whether he thought her teacher was secretly a vampire. He answered every question. He never missed a pickup. He kept baking. What nobody saw except Iris was that Leonard also kept one habit he'd had since culinary school. Every week, no matter how exhausted he was, he developed a new recipe, not for a customer, not for income, just for the discipline of it, and because Marguerite had always told him that the day he stopped experimenting was the day he started dying professionally, and she said things like that with such certainty that ignoring her advice even after her death felt somehow disrespectful. Over the years, quietly, those recipes accumulated. He developed a brown butter caramel with a specific ratio of sea salt that 3 professional pastry chefs, upon tasting it later, independently described as the closest thing to a memory of childhood they had ever eaten. He worked for 8 months on a honey sponge cake, using local wildflower honey from a beekeeper 2 towns over, adjusting the hydration and the fold technique until the crumb was so even and delicate it barely needed frosting. He experimented with fermented fruit fillings at a time when almost nobody in American home-style baking was doing it. arriving at combinations that were unusual without being alienating. Flavors that surprised people and then made them reach immediately for another bite. All of it stayed in Millbrook. Until the Hargrove Culinary Invitational announced its amateur division. The Hargrove was not a local competition, it was held annually at the Hargrove Institute in Chicago, a culinary school with a reputation that went back 70 years, with alumni running kitchens in 4 countries. The amateur division had launched 3 years earlier as a way to surface undiscovered talent outside formal culinary training. Past participants had gone on to open restaurants, win regional awards, appear on television. Leonard read about it online at 11:30 on a Tuesday night while Iris slept and a half-finished coconut layer cake sat on the counter beside him. He stared at the application for a long time. Iris found the browser tab open the next morning and asked him about it while she ate cereal. "Is that a cake competition?" "Something like that. Are you going to enter?" Leonard poured coffee without answering immediately. "Maybe," he said. Iris looked at the screen, then at him. She was 10 by then, with her mother's directness and a talent for silence that was slightly unnerving in a child. "Dad," she said, "enter the cake competition." He entered. The preparation took 3 months. Leonard chose his honey sponge as the foundation, the one he had spent 8 months developing, the one that used the wildflower honey from Harold Fitch's farm, just outside of Claiborne. He built a filling from fermented black cherries, layered with a mascarpone cream, that had taken him 4 separate attempts to get right. The exterior was finished in a matte, white Swiss meringue with hand-painted botanical details. Not the showy sugar sculptures that tended to win competitions, but something quieter, more considered. Something that looked like it belonged on a table in a real home. He drove to Chicago alone. Iris stayed with his neighbor, a retired woman named Dottie, who had been bringing meals over uninvited, since Marguerite died, and had essentially become a fixture in their household. Leonard arrived at the Hargrove Institute early on a Saturday morning, parked in a structure 3 blocks away because the lot was full, and carried his cake through morning drizzle in a box he'd reinforced with extra cardboard and sealed with painter's tape because the latch on his good carrier had broken 2 nights before, and he hadn't had time to replace it. The registration desk was staffed by culinary students in pressed chef whites. One of them looked at the taped box and said nothing, but her expression said enough. The tasting room was exactly as intimidating as Leonard had imagined. Long tables, low lighting, the quiet efficiency of people who worked in serious kitchens. Other competitors had brought their entries in proper carriers, some with their shop logos printed on the sides. Leonard recognized at least 2 of them. Small-batch bakery owners he'd seen featured in food publications. The judges were introduced at the start. The head judge was a woman named Christine Farwell, culinary director of a respected Chicago hospitality group, regular contributor to national food publications, former competitor herself. She moved through the room with the brisk certainty of someone who had evaluated thousands of dishes and stopped being surprised by most of them. Leonard set his cake on the assigned table and carefully cut a presentation slice. That was when Christine Farwell looked over, took in the painter's tape on the box, the flower still visible on his apron from the drive, the unornamented presentation without the props and placards other competitors had brought, and said something to the judge beside her. They both laughed. It wasn't cruel exactly, it was the laughter of people who had already decided, before tasting anything, that they understood what they were looking at. A hobbyist from somewhere. A home baker who hadn't fully grasped the environment he'd walked into. Another judge, a younger man with the groomed confidence of someone who'd had his photograph in food magazines, walked past Leonard's station without stopping. Presentation matters, he said generally, to no one in particular, but the angle of it was clear. Leonard stood beside his cake and waited. He did not argue. He did not explain the painter's tape, or the apron, or the 4-hour drive, or the garage shop, or the 3 months of preparation, or the 8 months before, that spent developing the recipe alone. In a kitchen, in Millbrook, Tennessee, at 4 in the morning, while his daughter's upstairs he waited. Christine Farwell tasted the cake last. She had moved through the other entries efficiently. Pleasant nods, brief notes on her clipboard, the occasional murmured comment to a colleague. Professional, measured, unreadable. She picked up a fork, cut a small piece from Leonard's presentation slice, and put it in her mouth. She stopped writing, she put the clipboard down, she cut a larger piece. The room, which had the ambient noise of quiet industry, did not go dramatically silent. This was not a movie. What happened was subtler, and, in some ways, more significant. Christine Farwell simply became very still. The kind of stillness that happens to experienced people when something breaks through the professional distance they've spent years building. She tasted it again. Then she looked up and found Leonard standing quietly across the table, watching her with the patient attention of a man who had learned not to expect much, and had stopped performing for an audience that wasn't there. "What's in the filling?" she asked. Leonard told her. Fermented black cherries, mascarpone, a small amount of reduced balsamic to sharpen the acidity, a fold of whipped cream to lighten it. The honey in the sponge came from a single-source beekeeper in rural Tennessee, wildflower, harvested in August when the clover was at its peak. Christine listened. She asked about the fermentation process. Leonard answered. She asked about the meringue finish, the technique for achieving that particular matte texture, without the exterior weeping in transit. Leonard explained it, including the adjustment he'd made to the sugar ratio after 2 failed attempts in humid summer conditions. She asked about his background. He told her. Culinary school briefly, before money ran out. Years in a garage shop in Millbrook. A daughter, a wife who died. Christine Farwell did not offer condolences with the practiced efficiency of someone filing information away. She went quiet for a moment, then she tasted the cake one more time, set down her fork with the deliberateness of someone making a decision, and moved to the next station. Leonard drove back to Millbrook with the cake box empty in the passenger seat, and no real certainty about what had happened. The competition results would be announced in 6 weeks. He had learned not to project. He'd been disappointed by enough things in his life to know that hope, when unearned, was just anxiety with better branding. He told Iris the basics when he picked her up from Dottie's. "How did it go?" Iris asked. "I don't know yet," Leonard said. "Did they like it?" "One person did, I think." Iris absorbed this. "One's enough," she said. He went back to work. Orders came in. He baked through mornings and evenings. He woke at 4, drove Iris to school, came home, and worked until pickup, worked again after dinner, went to bed late. The routine was its own kind of scaffolding, not a joyful life, exactly, but a structured one, and structure had kept him upright through things that should have knocked him flat. 3 weeks after Chicago, he got a phone call. It was Christine Farwell. She was not calling about the competition results. Those, she said, were still being finalized. She was calling because she had spent 2 weeks thinking about his honey sponge, and wanted to discuss something. Christine Farwell ran, in addition to her work with the hospitality group, a culinary development program that she had founded 4 years earlier. A small, private initiative that identified overlooked talent outside formal culinary institutions and provided mentorship, commercial kitchen access and industry connections. It had launched 4 small businesses and helped 2 people secure positions in serious restaurants. She was calling to ask if Leonard had ever considered expanding. Leonard was standing in his garage at the time, a piping bag in one hand, Iris's homework spread on the workbench beside him. "Expanding how?" he said. Christine laid it out directly. She believed the honey sponge, specifically the combination of the single-source ingredient sourcing, the fermented filling technique, and the finish method, was not a home baker's recipe. It was a product, a serious one, with the potential to anchor a specialty bakery concept that the current market in several mid-sized cities could support. She had contacts, she had resources, she was not offering charity, she was identifying an opportunity and asking if Leonard was interested in pursuing it seriously. Leonard stood very still for a moment. Iris looked up from her homework and watched him. "I have a 10-year-old, he said. "I know," Christine said. "You mentioned her. My operation is a garage. I know that too. I've never run anything bigger than what I have." "Mr. Hoyt," Christine said, "I tasted 43 cakes that day. Yours was the only one I've thought about since. I'm not asking you to be certain, I'm asking you to consider it." Leonard set down the piping bag. The competition results came in 2 weeks later. Leonard had won the amateur division. The judges' notes, which Christine forwarded to him separately, described his entry in language that pastry professionals rarely used in formal evaluation. Words like integrity and memory, and, from Christine herself, the kind of technique that doesn't come from training, but from years of listening to what a recipe needs. The announcement circulated through the food world in the limited way that culinary competition results do. Significant within the industry, invisible outside it, but it reached people who mattered. 2 journalists contacted Leonard. A food blogger with a substantial following wrote a piece about the Millbrook garage shop that Leonard had never sought publicity for and had no idea how to respond to. Dottie read the piece aloud to him at his kitchen table. "It says you're a hidden gem," she reported. "That's a nice way to say nobody's heard of you," Leonard said. "Same thing, different light," Dottie said. He agreed to Christine's program. What followed was not a movie montage. It was slow, difficult, frequently discouraging, and filled with problems Leonard had not anticipated. Licensing requirements, commercial kitchen regulations, supplier negotiations, the particular exhaustion of trying to scale something handmade without losing what made it worth scaling. There were weeks when he wondered if he had made a catastrophic mistake by leaving the manageable discomfort of the garage for the unmanageable complexity of ambition. But he kept going. Partly because Christine was relentless in a way that reminded him, uncomfortably, of Marguerite. Partly because the work itself, when he stripped away the business anxiety, was still the work he had always loved. And partly because Iris, who was following developments with the focused interest of a child who had decided this mattered, told him at least once a week that she was going to work there someday, and he had learned not to argue with her about things she'd already decided. 18 months after Chicago, Leonard opened a small specialty bakery in Nashville. Not a flagship, not the kind of opening that shut down a street and required a velvet rope. A quiet opening, by invitation, to about 60 people. Chefs, food writers, the beekeeper Harold Fitch, who drove up from Claiborne and stood in the corner looking simultaneously proud and bewildered, Dottie and Iris. Christine Farwell was there. So were 2 of the judges from the Hargrove tasting panel, including the younger man who had walked past Leonard's station without stopping and remarked that presentation mattered. He stood in front of the honey sponge for a long time, without saying anything. Then he turned to Christine, and in a voice that carried exactly the difficulty of a person recalibrating something they'd believed about themselves, he said, "I made a mistake in that tasting room." Christine looked at Leonard across the room. Leonard was explaining the fermentation process to Harold, who was nodding with the satisfaction of a man who grew the honey, and was only now understanding what had been done with it. "Yes," Christine said. "You did." The bakery review that ran 6 weeks later in a Nashville food publication used the word extraordinary in the 3rd paragraph and patient genius in the 5th. A James Beard nomination followed the next year. Not a win, but a nomination, which in the industry carried its own specific weight. Leonard framed neither the review nor the nomination. What he did frame, and what hung beside the bakery's serve window where he could see it from the kitchen, was a photograph Iris had taken the morning of the Nashville opening. He was standing at the prep counter before anyone arrived, frosting a test cake alone in the early light, flour on his apron, completely unaware of the camera. He looked, in that photograph, exactly like what he was. A man who had lost a great deal and kept working anyway, a man who had been told, in various ways throughout his life, that what he had was not enough for the rooms he was trying to enter. What he looked like, to anyone who looked at that photograph carefully, was someone who had already decided none of that was going to stop him. Before this story ends, consider this. Have you ever walked into a room and felt, before you said a single word, that the people in it had already decided who you were? And were you right? Or did something happen that changed it? Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the only one in the room who actually knows what they're doing, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the world figures that out before it's too late. If this story stayed with you, like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Kindness Tales. There are more stories like this one, there always are.